Cool. Are we good, Chris?
Yeah.
Cool. Hello, everyone. Phil, you gave a really good presentation there. This is slightly lacking in the professionalism department. And just some disclaimer, I'm horrendously hungover at the moment. I just thought I'd get that out there, so when you're wondering why this was really shitty, that's why. No, that should be okay. Also, you guys don't really look like front-end developers. The last time I gave this talk was to a room full of front-end devs, so we'll see how this goes. Anyway, so this is my presentation. To get on the, I guess, shortlist to give this talk, I need to give it a title like Mocking Made Easy, which is not very cool. So I have a different name for it. I like to call it Mocking and Glocking there. I think I've got, oh yeah, there we go. That's quite cool. Yeah. So I guess that's sort of like a little bit of a joke, but you'll sort of see we actually get into some guts of it in a little bit. Just some disclaimers here. I am going to eventually talk about a library that I wrote, and that usually gets like a collective groan. But it's literally the best thing in the world, so it's worth the pimping. And yeah, hopefully you like this talk. I hope it's somewhere in the top 2 for the night, so that's good. And yeah, the hungover disclaimer. So yeah, anyway, so this is me. I'm Dave. Hello, everyone. I am a developer for OVO Energy, so I work with Chris. I've been there for a couple of years. I live and work in London. That's my email. That's my GitHub. Don't look at my personal website. Don't look at my GitHub link. They're both full of garbage. So yeah, this is how about the next 25 minutes are going to go. Hopefully, I do take up the time. I think this is probably a more condensed version of this talk. But yeah, anyway, I sort of want to talk to you guys about testing web applications locally or in an integration environment. And I guess the ways that we inject mock data into those applications. I think it's something that has gone sort of quite untalked about in the front-end communities. There's a lot of de facto standards that I think are really cumbersome. Attitudes are slowly changing in that space. However, I think that people just put up with these polished solutions just because they don't want to use anything else. Excellent. That's cool. So yeah, anyway, I just want to sort of talk about that and then talk about what I think a more reasonable solution for that is. It really depends on what theory you subscribe to when it comes to testing your applications. This is just what I think is a good idea. It's not necessarily the best idea. It's not the worst. It's just something I'd like to share with you guys. So yeah, when we're dealing with web applications, I guess everyone has to check out the code at some point, and ideally when you're installing dependencies and you're running your unit tests for the first time, and you actually want to load up the application for the first time, ideally that's painless. Ideally when you're trying to add in new functionality into an application and you're developing it locally, ideally that's painless as well. Your backend developers might not have written the endpoints that you need to talk to yet, or maybe you're the developer that's doing that as well and you want to do the front-end stuff first. And obviously you want your application state to be, in whatever state you want it to be when you're running things locally, even if you aren't talking to a production or staging API or service. But it needs to be deterministic at the same time. That's all real textbook stuff. And everyone's probably thinking, yeah, okay, that's obviously the ideal solution there. But in the real world, it really isn't like that. I'm sure for whatever projects you guys have worked on, you go and you check out, you clone the repository and the README says, run this command, and you run it and it doesn't work and you're left scratching your head. And that kind of sucks. And I think that that's something that people maybe don't talk about as much these days. So this is sort of what I'm going to talk about. So yeah, I guess the first question that we should sort of talk about, ask here is, where have we seen, like, how do we see data being injected into applications, like when running locally, like on your laptop or whatever? you might be working with a prototype or something, or you're working, I don't know, at some company that doesn't believe in any sort of good practices, and you're running your local application against a production service. Obviously, if you do that, you'll go to developer jail. That's not a very nice place. You have to argue with people about tabs versus spaces and Vim versus Emacs and all of that. It sucks. So yeah, I'm not really going to talk about that anymore. You might run your application against a staging service, so a slightly more isolated environment. You're not going to be changing people's details in the real world and all of that. But that will also get you sent to developer jail. That's not really a great idea either. You could run your application against a local copy of whatever backend services. So you might have containerized that environment. You might have over-engineered that to the nth degree as well. It's a little bit less naughty, as I say here. It might keep you out of dev jail. It might not. I'm not too sure. But it sucks. It's a lot of work. Like if I said to one of you guys at the moment, by the end of this talk, I want you to containerize your back-end environments and have some front-end service start to consume from that. You probably can't, or it will be pretty fragile at best. So yeah, we've all heard about things like this being done before. We've all done it ourselves. We'll all probably do it again at some point in the future. But it's just not great. And I guess as I'm predominantly a front-end developer these days. And the things that I like to do is focus on the meaningful parts of like the actual domain of the problem that I'm trying to solve. Once again, this is all really textbook stuff. I haven't said anything new or interesting really yet. But the thing that I don't really like to do when I'm writing front-end code is worrying about back-end services. That's not particularly fun for me. And I guess going back to, I don't want to have to continually update something for like a back-end service if it's not actually what's going to end up being run in production. And I'm not going to be running it against something in production when I'm writing it. So yeah, I don't really know why I wrote this slide. This is just the previous slide, Venn diagram form. I think I was bored at work. So yeah, and I don't even think that is everything that I've got there, but it doesn't matter. We could run a mock API server that serves up canned responses, and it isn't actually implementing all of our back-end business logic. We might just specify what the endpoint is and what we want the response to that endpoint to be. And most of these days, I think the three most popular things that I've listed there, JSON server, node mock server, and API mocker. There are a lot of other alternatives. That might be a slight exaggeration, the number there. Or you could even just, it's not that hard to spin up a node server, a service, and just write out these endpoints, and you don't even need to worry about an off-the-shelf solution to serve up canned responses. That's not even a massive amount of work either. If you don't care about, I don't know, maybe you've got things that will require specific request headers, or you want specific response headers as well. So yeah, there are plenty of things that can do this. Something like JSON server is quite nice. It's somewhat elegant. You specify a JSON file, and you have the name of your endpoint, and you have the associated response with it. There are some levels of configuration with it. It's been a while since I've looked at JSON server. I'm pretty sure that you can make it do some pretty fancy stuff. And it's very easy to launch as well. It's just one line. You can even tell it to watch the JSON file, so you can make changes to that. You don't have to worry about restarting the processes. Cool. The thing that sucks about it is that you're now having to write JSON files for this sort of stuff. Nothing's typed. The documentation for JSON server sucks. It's a little bit of a pain as soon as the complexity starts to ramp up with your project. You introduce more endpoints into your application. Maybe you've got, I'm going to mention the word scenario support a few times, and we'll delve into that in a little bit once we start writing some code. And then we've got something like API mocker, which I think is really popular. God knows why. I was going to give a code example for this, but I thought it would just be more fun to bring up the GitHub page for it. I'll just zoom in a little bit, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, what is it? I actually don't know how many downloads it gets a month, but anyway, cool, great, it's got loads of documentation, that's pretty sweet. This is what the configuration file looks like for it. There's like 700 different things here to describe your endpoints that you're trying to mock and the responses. It's just got loads and loads and loads of stuff, and not all of this is actually documented. There's been plenty of times on projects where I've had to delve into the source code for this. And to do things like scenario support, you need to use a JSON path, which is like XPath, but worse, if XPath could get worse. Like no one understands it ever. You need to Google all of that stuff. But yeah, I know this sounds like I'm sort of slagging off a lot of these things, but I think that all these things that I've already talked about are incredibly popular, but they're also incredibly difficult to use. As you can see, I'm sure that you've tried reading through this now. It's not particularly fun to read. It's not simple, even though when you're actually using this in your applications, the overall effect is it's a very simple thing that it is providing. So yeah, not really a massive fan of that. But we could perhaps do something else. And I wrote a library called DatumOx, and my girlfriend drew the logo for this on the train home one day, and it combines what she thinks are the two favorite things in my life, which are beards and ransom letters. And I think she's captured that quite well. So yeah, so we got DatumOx. It wasn't just me that wrote this library, actually. It was conceived on we had like an open source day at work. Me and a couple of guys got together and sort of started to hash this out, but I'm the main maintainer on this now. And it is actually based off, I guess the inspiration for it was from a library written for Angular called Angular Multimox, which uses the same principles that we're about to discuss. So really, I've ripped them right off. And I've ripped off quite a lot of the source code, actually. I'm not sure what licenses are there, but I've definitely broken some sort of, I'm sure if the GPL police get onto me or whatever. No, not really, actually. That's a bit of a joke. But yeah, basically, it uses code-driven config. So we're not writing big, ugly JSON files that are poorly documented. Where we define what endpoints we want to mock out in our application. So that's just a regular expression that is matched against your endpoint. And then what we want the response to a call to that endpoint to be. And we can define what I refer to as scenarios, which are sort of just like what happens in a non-happy path for a call to that endpoint. So maybe you've got a call to /foo, which usually just returns a 200 with some sort of object. What happens if a call to that endpoint fails? Well, we can define a failure scenario for that where, maybe it gives us a 400 or whatever and some sort of error object so that we can actually test that in our application too, which is pretty cool. It's not really invasive to integrate with your application, which we're going to see in a minute. It's, as I said, it's drawn inspiration from Angular Multimox, but this is framework agnostic. It works with vanilla JavaScript, Angular, React, AngularJS, React Native, which is pretty sweet. It works with XHR and Fetch, which is pretty cool. And it doesn't take too much effort to set up. And you get a lot of benefits in your local testing environments and your integration testing environments. I actually added some stuff to the live coding today that I haven't done before, so that's probably going to fail catastrophically. But yeah, let's actually stop talking about this and start writing some code. Hopefully this works. Basically, what I've spun up here is a React application. Don't worry too much if you're not familiar with React. This is really, really, really simple. And I just thought of some random scenario where I guess in my head, we're dealing with an endpoint that returns some sort of some object that describes the size of a shift that a shift worker is going to be working. I'll give you a quick peek at the source code, and ooh, that's spoilers right there. So the entry point to this application, I will make this quite a lot bigger. Let's do that. We don't need the console. Yeah, cool. So all my application is actually doing is rendering out this thing called some component onto the page. Cool. That's not difficult to follow. And inside this component here, this is all the HTML that ends up getting rendered out to the page. Some of it is conditionally rendered. We've got some static text here, which will print out something. And then what we then do is when the component actually mounts on the page is we make a call to a node service that I've written. We're going to pretend that that's actually our production service. Obviously, this isn't a very production sort of app. But it's got an endpoint called next shift, which is going to get something back, which we actually log out, which we'll see. And then it just updates the state for the component. And once we actually have this thing called next shift size, it's going to render out this block of HTML here. And that'll be very easy to see when I bring up my browser. Let's make this bigger. Cool. OK, so there we go. This is all it does. However, if you are paying attention to what's being rendered out here, there is a little bit more than what we just saw on the screen. Is that we actually had this conditional part here to say if the next shift size was large, then we should print out something else here. Be prepared to put in a mighty big shift. This is the dumbest example that I've ever done for a talk ever. But obviously, we would probably, as a front-end developer, we would like to see how this actually looks and behaves on the screen. Obviously, if we had weird behaviors with it, maybe it's got a different theme to it, or it behaves different on mobile. Let's pop a console here. Things that we could do. Oh, that's lots of errors. That's pretty cool. Okay, well, we're gonna pretend that we can't see those. Of course, that happens. Oh, you know what? Actually, I can tell you why that is. I'm probably not running my node service. That's pretty good. Let's hide that. That can go away. Server. I'm going to assume I'm using Yarn here. Yep. Cool. Dave's sick API server is running now. All this does is serve up a... Yeah, there we go. Cool. Excellent. We got a response back. So yeah, that's just redundant. Every time I reload the page, that's just going to give me, but I've put an artificial delay in there of like a second just to simulate what might be to fetch some data from an endpoint. This is just returning back medium every time, as you can see. But obviously in the real world, sometimes we have non-deterministic APIs. Maybe we don't know what it's going to send back. That's not great for testing things locally, obviously. That's not great for testing things in an integration environment. And I guess what I could do, because I am just running a local service here, I could just jump into the backend code somewhere here. Oh, no, not that. And instead of returning back this JSON file here, I could just hard code this to send back something else, and then I could reload the server and reload the web page, and I could do that. But that's quite long and boring. So what we're actually going to do here is we're going to kill off the node service now, and we're going to smash DatumOx into this and see how easy that is. So I've written a list of steps more so I don't forget, because that would be really embarrassing. But, whoops, probably, I think I just pasted in a password into there. That was pretty smart. Whoops. Yeah, it's okay, just blur it all, it's fine. But yeah, so we just got a few steps here. The last one's obviously probably the most important one. But basically, we only have to do a couple of things so we can do this. So the first thing that we really need to do is we need a way to have an entry point into our application for a development environment, I guess. We could do that. We could just do it within this component, but that's probably not great. So what I can do here is I can go into my source directory and I can copy my app component and I can just call it maybe app.dev.tsx. Does that work? Yep. So that's step one done, I think. In the Webpack config for this, you probably don't care too much about this. But I have a dev Webpack config that's actually pointing to app.dev.tsx. You could do this any sort of way you want. You could have it all done in one Webpack config, and you could have your entry point just be one config where you check the environment to see if you're in a dev environment, then we'll do something. Otherwise, do something else. But the next thing that we need to do is actually, we have a function called injectMox, which is exposed by Datamarks. I've already installed this as a dependency in the project. So I can just go import injectMox. Oh, it's done that for me there. Cool. So that's that step done. Now we need to define the mocks that we want to use for application. Fortunately, our component only calls out to one endpoint, which is this next shift endpoint. So I've actually defined a file called mocks, and that just exports an object called mocks, and that just is a mapping of scenarios. So we always have a default scenario, which is like our happy path, or what we want our application to do, I guess in just its regular way. So that just exports an array of mock objects. Because we only have one endpoint, we're just exporting one object. The 5 things that we need to know about it are the URL, which is a regular expression that matches the URL that we're trying to mock. The HTTP method, in this case it's a GET. The response that we want to respond with, so in this case it's responding with medium, just like it did when we were running our production service. Our response code, which is the HTTP response, which is 200, and a delay in milliseconds. So this is saying 1/4 of a second delay. We can add whatever we want. The first 3 things are required. The second 2 things default to these values. I just thought I'd show you guys anyway. So anyway, all we need to really do now to get this working, I think, is just in our entry point to our application, if we import that mock object from that file there. Once again, we could have done this in this file. We didn't. This is just for organizational purposes. I just wanted to separate out the mocks from the entry point code. So we do that, and we can fire up our application. Let's fire up our application with our dev config. I don't know why I'm drinking this beer. I feel awful. Okay. Cool, let's reload this. Cool, that worked, that's great. So yeah, as you can see, I've now got the exact same behavior as what we had before, except we're not actually connecting out to any sort of database or service or whatever. That's not particularly interesting yet. The thing that's really cool is when we start talking about scenarios. So it's probably easiest to just code and talk while I'm doing this. So we have the default scenario, and we didn't have to do anything funky there. We just used DatamOx with the default scenario, and we got the default set of behavior. But let's define a scenario, and we'll call it large. And it's on the same URL. So we'll do it on next shift. Oh yeah, it's probably an object, isn't it? Cool. And once again, it's still a get, and the response is going to be large. We can cast it as a shift. We don't really have to do that, but I have. We'll keep the response code the same. We'll be verbose here. Let's just for fun, we'll add in 3 seconds of delay here. And then basically what we can do here is if I reload the application, it's still going to give me the default set of behavior here, as you can see. However, what we can do, if we go back into the entry into our application, there's actually an optional second parameter to this injectMox function, which is specifying the scenario that we want to run. So one thing we could do is we could specify the large scenario, and then hopefully when this reloads, you've got about 3 seconds of delay there, and now it's responding back with large, and we've also got that extra text down there that we haven't actually seen in our application yet, and you can see in really small, just on the side here where we were logging out the API response, is it is responding back with large. We probably don't need the console anymore. And that's quite cool. However, the problem with this is that I had to manually specify in my code what scenario I want to run. And that's not particularly fun. So a way that we can sort of make this a little bit more fun is Datamarks also, what is it? Yeah, cool. I also expose another function called extract scenario from location, which is the location object in the browser. Location. Oh, good. Excellent. How does this work again? Oh goodness me, how have I forgotten this? Anyone want to help me out here? Oh, actually, you know what? Because I'm really, really good, I bet you in the README I've actually specified how to do this. This is, yeah, I haven't done this talk since December. That's slightly embarrassing. Let's try to say window location. Apparently, oh, right, because I'm an idiot. That's why. Because I didn't actually call the function that I was doing that. Yeah. So we can extract the scenario from our URL, and how that looks is if I jump back into here, and in the query string, if I say scenario equals, well, if I specify nothing, it'll give me the default set of behaviors. And if I chuck in scenario equals large, it will give me the large scenario. So that's like, that specific bit of functionality is where I see the beauty in this, because I really don't see I don't really see how you can make that much easier to do that sort of stuff. And where that really shines, and this is what I added on the train into Bristol today, so let's see if this works. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Cypress or Selenium, just something to run like automated browser like automated UI tests. So I've got Cypress here, and okay, I should probably change the base URL for that, which is in Cypress, probably 8081, I guess. Let's try that. Cool. So just to give you an idea of what like an integration test could look like for this application, is you could say days rad Cypress test. You know, it shows medium for the standard run. So we visit just the root URL, and we're making an assertion that on the page this is contained, which is your new shift size is medium. And then for a large run, when we specify the large scenario, that it then contains this. And what that looks like in the browser should be something like this. If you haven't seen Cypress run before, this isn't the most fun example, but Cypress is a lot of fun. It'll spin up a browser in your browser, and it runs through all of the steps that you tell it to take. So for the medium run, I know that it's probably a little bit difficult to see this, but it doesn't matter that much. On the medium run, when you sort of step through the life cycle of this, you can see that somewhere here is that it can find that text on that, and then for a large run, it can find that text on that. That makes this sort of testing really pleasurable. It's not something that I see easily done in a lot of cases, because if you're going to run those sorts of tests using something like JSON server or whatever, you need to then spin up a node server to do that, and it's a lot more code, a lot more messing around. So yeah, we just talked about the integration test stuff. I'll skip over that because we don't really need to know. I've sort of bigged this up a lot, and I've sort of talked a lot of the other things down, which isn't really fair because they are really good solutions. They're well polished. They've got massive followings. You know, they work. They're tried and trusted. And there are things that DatumOx still doesn't do yet. We don't have any sort of logging middleware for it yet. So because we're intercepting the HTTP requests before they're being made, they don't show up in the network tab in your browser. So you don't really know, that you can't really see at that level what's actually happening. That's not too hard to implement. I just haven't gotten around to implementing it yet. Actually, this now exists. Someone submitted a pull request for it, but for unmatched endpoints, there was no like pass-through ability to actually call through to that API if you wanted to. And then things like simulating paginated data and stuff like that, there's not an easy way of doing that with this library, whereas some of the other tools that I've talked about before, they do those and they do them quite well. So I'm sure I'll be ripping off some of their code pretty soon to get that functionality. And yeah, I guess the other thing that I really want is more users to test it. It fetches anywhere between 1 and 500 downloads a week, depending on whether I've done a talk on it or just written my own bash script to hammer it from NPM. Yeah. But yeah, I just want to get more feedback for it. I'm really convinced that this is a great thing that we've built. I really want people to tell me why it's not that great, or I just want people to use it and think of improvements or contribute to it. I've had plenty of contributors to it so far. So yeah, it's been a pretty interesting ride, sort of getting that up and going. Here's a bunch of links to things that you might find useful. Obviously, link to tonight's code is up there, to the actual DatumOx library. Some of the underlying things that like fetch mock and XHR mock, you know, that's some of the stuff that gets used under the hood in DatumOx. And then some of the example alternatives as well that I've been talking about and mostly slagging off. So yeah, that is the end of my talk. You can clap and cheer really loudly. Yeah. Hey, there we go. Thank you for dealing with my slow hungover self. It's been lots of fun. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask them now or whenever.
And can you repeat the question?
Yes, I will repeat the questions. Yep.
So I understand you're mocking out and getting errors back, but how do you know if your test passed or failed?
How do I know if the test passed or failed?
Are you literally looking at the screen, or are you comparing against some output you expect?
So I guess in the Cypress tests, are you talking about, or?
I don't know any web.
Okay, sure. So the question was like, how would you know if like your tests pass or fail? It's the same as like any sort of testing scenario, I guess, like whether that's unit testing or, you know, integration testing with like the UI tools that I was showing there, where it's you make like there's just assertions that you make on what you're observing. So for instance, with Cypress, you can, you know, navigate to a particular URL. You can interact with the page. Maybe if there's inputs, you know, text input, radio boxes, buttons, whatever. You can interact with all of that, and you can make assertions about what you see on the page. You might grab an element off the page and be like, okay, it needs to have this CSS class on it. It's not specifically or strictly text output that you're making assertions on. You might maybe you've got a really complicated flow in your application. Maybe it's like a sign-up stream for something where there's lots of forks in the sign-up process. So you can also make assertions on things like maybe certain other endpoints had requests made to them, or maybe like it's taken you to a specific URL, you know, /step1, /step2, step 3A, 3B, and all of that. So those are the sorts of things in that environment that you can make assertions on. Yeah, cool. Yep.
Do you have any strategies in your library or just when using it
That is a really good question, which was, how do you make sure that like your mocks don't get out of sync with the actual, with what your endpoints are actually doing? At the moment, no, there isn't really a strategy or like an opinion built into the library. It sort of ties into something else that I'm building on the side to help combat that actually, which I'm planning on giving a talk on once I finally finish it. But basically, if you have something like Swagger or RAML or whatever to describe your endpoints, you could have a tool that then takes those specs, you know, it's either YAML or RAML or whatever, and you could have that spit out your mocks, which could then get sucked into your local, like your application. So then you're not having to write the mocks yourself. You could have something from a spec generating it, and that's not very hard to do. Like I've been experimenting with that with the last couple of weeks with that and generating like TypeScript like typings for things like that as well. So then that even saves your users from having to write the mocks themselves. Obviously, you might want to be more specific on top of that. Maybe, you know, the things with like the delay or like response headers and stuff like that. Maybe you still want to be specific. I haven't given it that level of thought yet. But yeah, that's a very good question though. Yep.
Can scenarios inherit one another?
No, that's a damn good question though. Can scenarios inherit from one another? No, I haven't actually thought about that actually. How it does work at the moment though, I've given a really basic example here where we just got one endpoint and we're overriding that endpoint effectively in this scenario. If we had other, so if I just duplicate this for a sec, if we just had like some other endpoint here and we didn't specify something in the large scenario for some other endpoint, the resultant set of mocks there would be the overridden next shift mock plus the some other endpoint mock there. So it kind of aggregates like that, but it isn't necessarily an inheritance model like you're talking about there. But that's something that I haven't thought about, but that is very cool. Yep.
I think probably leads off that one, but you can't have relationships between, so you want to call an API and get like a list of cars, for example, and then you drill in, so you get an ID. Can you subsequently query and drill in more data? So like a relational model?
Not a relation, so yeah, the question was, is there like sort of like a relational model between the mocks? No, not really. However, I'm not too sure if this is going to answer your question, but there's like nothing stopping you from taking, you know, if the first thing you're doing is like, for instance, in like the car example, if the first thing that you do is get a list of cars and their IDs or whatever, there's nothing stopping you from using the response of that to then call another mock, which might be, you know, something like maybe you've got next, let's do the cars one. So you've got cars and then cars, slash, and then, you know, maybe there's, because this is just a regular expression, maybe you've got like 4 digits like as the ID or whatever, and then you could use the ID that you pulled from the first thing into that. I know that isn't really directly answering your question there though, but
I'd have to set up loads of them.
yeah, you would, because they are two separate endpoints. Like you can't. I don't know if you could really have a deterministic way or a reliable way of being able to just have it automatically work out what endpoints you've got, unless you had something like I was talking about with the previous question. If you had something that in like to some sort of spec describe all of the endpoints in your application, then you could have it generate that and have some sort of, maybe you could have some sort of relational model between those two. Yeah. Yep.
Is there a way to include URL parameters?
Hmm?
Is there any way to include URL parameters?
As like query string stuff?
Yeah, so if you had like additional parameters that were as part of your endpoint.
Yep, that'll all work as, like straight out of the box. The question was, will it support like URL parameters as well? Yeah. It'll also like match on things like You can also define mocks. Actually, I think this is, there's probably a couple of things that I haven't quite talked about there. You can get a little bit fancier with your mocks that you're defining there. You could say, you know, it's a call to /cars, and I think the parameter is request headers. I can't quite remember. I'd have to. It's been a little while since I've actually had to use that. Let's have a look. Headers. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So you got like response headers, so you can like specify custom response headers, and you can also match on request headers as well. So yeah. Nothing else? Cool. Well, I mean, if you've got any other questions, feel free to grab me. Otherwise, ping me on GitHub or shoot me an email or whatever. It's something that it's a topic that I'm reasonably passionate about, just because I think that it's been such a long time since people have like sort of tried to shake things up in this space, and I'm always for trying new things to solve these sorts of problems. So yeah, thanks guys.